Hello and welcome everyone to another edition of Sustaining Sustainability. I'm your host, CB Bhattacharya, Professor and Director of the Center for Sustainable Business at the University of Pittsburgh. If you remember, last time we had as our guest Rebecca Marmot, the Chief Sustainability Officer of Unilever, and she had so much interesting information to offer us that we decided to do a two-part podcast series. So today we are going to continue chatting with Rebecca and learning more about Unilever's plans as they move forward with their sustainability agenda. Rebecca, welcome back to the show.
Hi, CB. Thanks for having me back.
Nice to have you here. So, Rebecca, last time we chatted, we left off at the point of the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, how it was so audacious and over a 10-year period. But now that 10-year period's coming to a close, you have had a change of leadership as well. In the meantime, Paul Polman gone, Alan Yope in. So, can you talk a bit about the next chapter of Unilever's sustainability journey beyond the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan?
Great, of course I can. So you're absolutely right. We set out the 10-year plan in 2010 with quite a lot of those goals and targets scheduled to end at the end of this year, at the end of 2020. So a couple of years ago, we started to think about what's the next stage for us? How do we build on the successes of the USLP, but also integrate some of the learnings and some of the challenges? And what would that mean for us as we continue still on that ultimate aim and objective of trying to make sustainable living commonplace? So the first thing we did was, well, we need to interview people, and we need to understand the perspectives of lots of the different stakeholders in that multi-stakeholder model that we talked about last time, CB. So one of the first things we did was actually internally to say to 40,000 different employees across Unilever, different countries, different functions, working in different jobs, really to try and get a sense and get lots and lots of different perspectives to understand what they thought we ought to do as we move forward. What were those big areas that were important to society that perhaps were important in 2010 when we launched the USLP, or perhaps newer? And then really, how would Unilever actually grapple with those? How would we change the business? And I think sort of three big things came back. One around really trying to better leverage the brands and bring a lot of this work around purpose and thinking about how we can use the brands as a force for good and encourage behavior change. That was one thing. I think the second part was really make sure that we embed sustainability into every single part of the business. I think we've made brilliant advances in supply chain on the sustainable sourcing front. We've made pockets, I think, of brilliant progress in lots and lots of different areas. But actually, if we're truly going to think about doing business in a different way, we have to have sustainability at the core of every single way that we're operating the business, whether we're thinking about investments, whether we're thinking about the work with retailers and bringing sustainability to life, what we would call the international customers, the supermarkets or small scale retailers, what we can do when it comes to working with civil society, what can we do when we're coming to think about how can we make a difference working with NGOs, etc. And then I think that the third part is, how do we build on that sense of collective action that we'd started with the USLP and bring others along on the journey? So what we're moving into now is really one joined up, integrated business strategy, which we're calling the Compass. We had, of course, at the USLP, sustainability embedded across the business, but to a certain extent, the USLP was still, as you know, the Sustainable Living Plan, a separate plan. Now we've just combined that into one operating model. We've got 5 big strategic pillars, which we'll be talking a little bit more about when we get into the new year. But of course, that will include still some very specific sustainability work. So, for example, the climate and nature goals that we announced in the summer, but all of it will be woven very much into the fabric of the business. So, yeah, I look forward to telling you a bit more next year and hopefully working with you to bring that to life.
That's wonderful to hear. So now Unilever has announced ambitious plans to clean up the cleaning by replacing fossil fuel ingredients from its laundry and cleaning products by 2030. This move is estimated to cost the company more than 1 billion euros. Can you tell us more about that initiative and how the company is making the business case, especially to investors, for that type of investment in sustainability? And can we expect similar moves in other product lines?
Yeah, so that's right. So, I said just a second ago, as part of this new Compass model, there will be, a very integrated approach to sustainability. And I mentioned about the climate and nature targets that we launched earlier this year. And I think Clean Future, is a really good way actually of demonstrating that. So we know when we look at how we can really embed environmental and social sustainability across the business, and we talked a bit about this last time, that it has to be done right the way across our own operations, across the value chain, through our brands, and then out into wider society. And I think a lot of the work, when we looked back at the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, around really trying to reduce the carbon footprint and improve the environmental footprint, very much relied on either A, the sourcing and setting up sustainable sourcing models for the commodities that were going into the ingredients. And then a lot of time and effort also spent on consumer behavior change and encouraging consumers to wash at lower temperatures if they were using a washing machine, for example. With that 1 billion, which we talked about just last month, we'll be able to do our sourcing in a different way, put a lot of money into research and development, innovation in circular cleaning, chemistry. And really, it's underpinned by this idea of the carbon rainbow approach to transition to renewable and recycled carbon. So sources from plant or air or marine sources and waste. So, a super clear business case for why we want to do that. And at the same time, in a product which really consumers can use, knowing that it's still going to deliver exactly the same high quality results that people want. They want to have clean clothes, they want to have a clean environment around them where they're living, but not at the cost of the planet. And actually by doing this, it's really revolutionizing the way through formulation that we will be able to minimize the carbon footprint of that whole portfolio. When we look at how the investment community is then starting to view these kind of announcements and these kinds of portfolios. I mean, just this year from April to July, we saw an amount of new money invested in ENG equity that exceeded the combined flows of the previous 5 years. It was over $70 billion. Investors are really waking up to the reality of high carbon emissions. But, this month here in the UK, for example, we saw Legal & General warning 500 companies to do more to tackle climate change or risk being named and shamed. It's a whole different way to really view and understand how the investment community is looking at things like the formulation of our products, the carbon footprint, etc. I mean, we do a lot of work urging governments to think about carbon tax so that business externalities are priced in, and actually you start to see then capital flowing away from companies who are accelerating the climate crisis. It makes business sense. So I think when you look at those two different areas, you think about how the investment community is now starting to look at carbon and companies producing carbon, and then you put that innovation lens on how we're going to really be able to reduce that by eliminating fossil fuel sources. It's a very joined up example, I think, of really what embedding sustainability means.
Isn't it also true in Unilever's case that there is a philosophy that you get the investors you deserve? I mean, particularly for our American audience, it might be informative to hear Paul Polman's move some time back to stop reporting quarterly earnings. Can you speak briefly about that moment?
That's really a part of this wider, I think, longer term and a multi-stakeholder business model that we talked about last time. So investors are hugely important to Unilever. We absolutely have to think about our shareholders. They are very important. We're thinking about people's pension funds. So of course, making sure that our shareholders are well served is a vital part of what Unilever or any big business is doing. But I think what we've tried to do with the multi stakeholder model is to say, in addition to thinking about short term shareholder returns, which of course is important, actually, we also need to think about, when we're talking about shareholders, longer term shareholder returns. So, not just that quarterly short reporting cycle over 12 weeks, but actually, if you're operating business in a different way and you're investing for the long term, you're going to see longer sustainable growth, not just sort of short-term peaks and troughs. So I think that was the thought when we were talking about shareholders. And then the second part of that is thinking about stakeholders beyond just the very important shareholders, also thinking about, of course, our employees first and foremost, but thinking about our customers, thinking about retailers, thinking about governments, thinking about NGOs, thinking about civil society, and really understanding how the way that we operate our business has an impact on all of those different stakeholders. And by taking that much more holistic approach, I genuinely feel that you end up with a business which grows in a sustainable way that better serves the needs of all of those different types of stakeholders. I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago in the last question, we talked about actually when you come back to investors, how much now they're starting to put a sustainability lens onto the way that they're viewing and valuing companies. Investors are doing that because actually this makes business sense. Half the world's total GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. We need to, all of us, still be here in 100 years. So we need to decarbonize fast. So I think the business case behind doing that is much better now and more widely understood and accepted.
As the world moves past COVID-19, many have noted that the social and economic hardship has been a small glimpse at what could be if we do not act to protect our people and our planet from existential threats such as climate change. So, taking an industry perspective now, how well do you think the consumer goods industry as a whole is preparing for the challenges ahead?
We've all seen the awful impact of COVID, but I think you're right, CB. Sadly, there are multiple crises piling up around the environment, around social equity. I think there has been some good progress in the consumer goods industry. I think in areas like deforestation, the implementation of technology to really help much better track deforestation. So, funding and investments in things like radar alerts for detecting deforestation, which means you're able in real time to be able to get updates on deforestation, is something that we've been working on quite recently with Nestle, Cargill, Mondelez, a few others. I think that's a good example of how tech is helping to keep the consumer goods industry on top of issues like that. I think certainly a lot of work across the industry on really trying to respond to particularly plastics, but also this, I think, much greater awareness on the importance of trying to move from a linear consumer goods model into much more of a circular economy. If we are going to avert those kind of crises, we really need to be able to invent our economies and the role that business plays to ensure that we're creating much longer term value for all of those different stakeholders, rather than just short term. And I think to do that, you need to see that shift to stakeholder capitalism that we were talking about in the last question, and reorganizing that purely short-term approach and thinking about how do you price in major externalities, so like carbon pricing, for example. How do you make sure that actually, as you're wanting to grow your business, you're doing it in a sustainable way within the planetary boundaries, using that circular model? I think a very interesting element that I'm sure will come more to the fore, and they're certainly seeing it gaining emerging traction in consumer goods, is when we think about fair value distribution across all of those different stakeholders. Actually, will that be a move towards mandatory reporting of non-financial metrics? And I think we're starting to see that. Unilever's involved in a project together with a number of others that the World Economic Forum is looking at through that International Business Council, on trying to set up a much more standardized approach to non-financial metrics. So, I think there's definitely been a lot of progress, a real sense of galvanizing action as we think ahead to next year. We have the COP here in the UK, the Global Biodiversity Summit. There's a lot of, I think, big international moments for business and society to really get behind progressing on this change and moving towards that 2030 agenda.
What is the most important message you want to convey to companies during the COVID-19 era?
I mean, from my personal perspective, I'd say it's looking after your people. The stress of these strange, scary times is, it's definitely taking a toll on us all. And I think, not just physical health, but your emotional and mental health. And I think, we need everybody, all of us need to be compassionate and just recognize that we're living through these unprecedented, strange times, and actually just remember that, and take care of each other, take care of our teams, take care of our people.
And finally, then, what call to action would you make to our other regular listeners?
I would say, actually, as a Brit, having stayed up last night to watch the US election, I thought it was incredible how the American people used their power to vote yesterday, and an unprecedented level of people wanting to be involved in influencing the future, which I think was actually really heartening to see. So, if people are doing that to exercise their thoughts around leadership within their country, I would also urge us all to think about how do we actually also spend the hard-earned cash that we have. Use your wallet to vote for individuals and companies that are fighting for the kind of world that you want to live in. Use your power as a consumer and as a citizen to really drive that change.
Rebecca Marmot, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you so much for making the time to visit with us, not once, but twice.
Thanks so much, CB. It was a real honor to be here.
And this is your host, CB Bhattacharya, saying goodbye, and please join us for our next edition of Sustaining Sustainability.
And before I sign off, I do want to say that this podcast is made possible by the help of my colleagues, Leslie Marshall, who's the Associate Director of the Center for Sustainable Business, and Alyssa Martinec, who is the Sustainability Coordinator of the Center for Sustainable Business. I'm your host, CB Bhattacharya. Bye-bye.